Welcome to Zero Trust Journey, where Zero Trust practitioners and leaders share unfiltered stories, leaving the marketing fluff behind. This is not another vendor pitch. It's a nonprofit community project founded for the people navigating the real Zero Trust journey. The views expressed are personal opinions and do not represent any organization. This content is for educational use only.
Welcome to another session of Zero Trust Journey podcast. My name is Victor Monga. I am producer of this podcast. This is a session, we call it Geek Show, where we talk about Zero Trust architecture. We talk about the technical terms, how to achieve it. So with me, I have co-host Steve Turner. Steve, I'm going to pass it out to you.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. And like Victor said, welcome to another episode of basically our Geek Chat, where we're going and talking to practitioners who have implemented a variety of different Zero Trust solutions. And with that, it's my immense pleasure to introduce Ben Tyminski to the show. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Ben, if you wouldn't mind, can you introduce yourself to our viewers, let them know a little bit about your career journey, kind of where you got started, what you're doing now?
Yeah, so my career started when I was actually in college still. I was a contractor quickly for a chemical company. I started in the weeds kind of doing the general IT work and printer work. And so I did industrial chemical labeling. So I learned a lot about printers very quickly and like the network communication that needs to run through that. Then I moved directly into finance. Spent 7 years at a finance company. Started again kind of like at the lower levels of a service/help desk, moving up into like major incident response, and then networked my way into an endpoint security role, starting as an analyst and moving into my final position like at the finance company was a endpoint security architect. So putting everything in place for any endpoint solution they ran, we did it through my group. And then during COVID, decided to make the switch to a totally different sector, which was media. I've been at the media company now for about 4 years, doing similar same stuff, working with endpoint engineers, working across functions, right? Multiple business units to get these endpoint solutions in, make sure they're architect for the right kind of environment, things like that, making sure the gaps and moving forward, all that. Switching from finance to media was quite a big shift. There's a lot of differences, but a lot of similarities at the same time.
Yeah. Ben, one of the joke we have about, I think, 15, 20 years ago, if you're in security, either you're in endpoint security or network security, what would be your preference? Network security or endpoint security?
Endpoint security. I've always like messed around with laptops, desktop servers, like at my house when I was younger, messing around with certain gaming systems, things like that, super loading them up. So I'm very comfortable there. I'm decent at network, but I get very tired of it. So I love to dig down deep on like how sensors work, how new programs are running in like GPUs and stuff like that. So I just love knowing like the ingrained embeddedness of like a Mac, a Windows device, or a new like flavor of Linux.
Sure. Yeah. Pre-2010, I would have actually argued with you and to be all network security camp, but cloud happened, COVID happened, and microservices happened, IoT happened. So now I just yielded and say, yes, yeah, endpoint security is actually far more important because network is so distributed. So I think since we're talking about endpoint, let's start with that. Endpoint is a key piece when we talk about Zero Trust architecture, and it's really at the center of it. And a lot of times we have heard that as long as I have EDR or EDR++, equally known as XDR, is that good enough? And we want to know from you, what exact policies would you recommend? What exact controls would you recommend for our audience and listeners for those who are considering Zero Trust? So just having an endpoint with the default settings is good enough? Or would you specifically recommend certain things, or it could be integration like, hey, integrate identity with your endpoint solution, or give us your insights into how to actually create a good Zero Trust architecture having endpoint at the center?
Yeah, so I mean, the first part of it, right, is asset management. I know that's kind of like you're big. Oh, Ben, that's
Easier said than done.
that's not endpoint, but it's something that's important, right? Because you need to understand where things are in the environment, right? Those endpoints are somewhere in the environment. It could be remote, it could be on domain, it could be a new business you're bringing in, right? Like all that stuff needs to be recorded to be able to successfully do an EDR, do an XDR, and then also add on top of it, right? So like EDR, right, is moving away from traditional AV and scanning. It's more behaviors, more machine learning anomalies that are happening. But that doesn't help you in a zero trust if you're allowing people to work remotely wherever they need to be, right? You need to lay on layers such as like DLP, device control, host-based firewalls, right? Like a basic host-based firewall doesn't do enough for zero trust. You should really try to take an effect of like knowing your applications. Are you pinning that exe to only talk through that program file and using specific ports to go out, right? Are you allowing them to use public Wi-Fi, or are you on the private Wi-Fi contained with a VPN putting you into the domain? Or even after that, right, is like containerizing. Are you using a secure browser or just a CASB, right? All those kind of have to be like thought about to kind of start your transition into zero trust, right? EDR, first layer of zero trust for like an endpoint. Getting that data in there, correlating it against behaviors to assume like conditional access, is it working? Are they getting to the right places or are they not? Should they be in that place? Right? The rule looks right, but how do they get there kind of thing, right? You need to kind of plug and play all those. Should John, be an accountant, be looking at this kind of PI information, right? That's where like DLP would come through. It's like, and then also you give them that access to start using this kind of technology. It's like, how are they potentially taking it off the machine, or are they trying to transfer it somewhere else? So that's where like device control comes, or like browser security browsers happen. Yeah.
One quick question on that one or follow up. The different profiles when it comes to endpoint, well, malware protection, or detonator prevention, or file prevention. You mentioned host firewall. So what exactly and how to balance that? Because there is a lot when it comes to it. Like, what's the ideal state looks like for a zero trust?
Honestly, like for like a host-based firewall, you can even do like a network microsegmentation through the host-based firewall, right? And so like that's kind of your end goal, is to really kind of understand all the applications, all the business functions, right? And separate their firewall needs. And that's really it. And you can do that through a host-based firewall of applying those AD groups or however you're deploying your conditional access to get them those kind of firewalls that they need, right? Like you don't want workstations talking to other workstations if they don't need to. You don't want a workstation accidentally hitting a server that doesn't need to be hit, right? Like that's where like a PAL could come in. But when you microsegment on a endpoint itself instead of at the network layer, right, you're breaking down a lot of the attack vectors already, because you're standardizing your RDP port. You're standardizing what apps can go through what services. You're not letting drift happen in Kubernetes and things like that, right? You can hit the drift prevention in Kubernetes if you want, but like you can layer that with a firewall or something to help kind of secure those modules.
So that's a good call out, Ben. I remember to Victor's point, back in the day, endpoint security was very much a checkbox. Like, I think when you and I, both working at the finance company back in the day, their checkbox was, do we have AV on the endpoint? Then the next checkbox was, do we have EDR on the endpoint? And to Victor's point earlier, it's evolved quite heavily on what the expectation is for endpoint security. Can you talk about some of the larger projects that you've done at either the finance company or the media company where you've been driving endpoint security, and it was more than just AV and EDR?
Yeah, so we kind of had this one project that was kind of an all-around like perfect time to do a overhaul of multiple security suites, and that was reducing the amount of endpoint protection tools on the machine, standardizing encryption, right? Standardizing an MDM for all OSs, right? Not just one for Windows, one for Mac. Figure out what to do with Linux, right? It was really converging everything at the same time. So we took like a 2-year, 1 year was prep, 1 year was implementation, and it was literally 4 years of that. And the hardest thing was, right? You're trying to do all this work at the same time. How do you do it in a gapped area, right? You don't want stuff leaking out. You don't want users being impacted with it and stuff like that. So what we did is we removed from a traditional AV of like scanning and things like that, and we still required that. A lot of places still require a legacy scan to happen. Does it provide benefit? Sometimes it does when you're just looking at basic data and you're holding stuff in databases and it's SQL injections, things like that, or dropping new malware packages. But moving forward into like an EDR stance, right? There's a lot of new options of how it works with, like, as I said before, like the behaviors, the machine learning. How do you get that in place while you're rolling out to do limited impact? And that's kind of like what we built a whole QA environment, ran like a business, gathered all that information for the business and slowly piloted it. And at the same time as doing a laptop rotation to get new drive encryption happening, the MDM onboarded and things like that, we were already placing the new tools in place from the start. So that's where that learning could happen a little sooner. And then anything that didn't meet the requirement for like a refresh, right, we were ripping live encryption and very quickly going with the new encryption, right? And then developing new services. And to do that, right, we're overriding GPOs, running local GPO, then resetting GPO, things like that. So, I mean, that was a huge project in itself, a literally 2-year initiative, all 3 OSs, right? And then Windows EDR itself is a beast. But then you think about 2000 kind of started like Mac kind of needs something, and it's just not. I scanned your files, right? EDR became a little bit more of a thing for Macs at that time. So it's the same time ripping out legacy Mac security, right? Of like the 2 functions you could select and putting actual like conditional prevention policies in there was a very huge task that we did. And,
It's so funny. Right before the call, Victor, myself, Mallory, and a whole bunch of other folks were just talking about how Mac OS, initially when it came out, everybody's like, it's a lot safer. But not that many people were using Macs in the environment, kind of out there in the wild. And it's a whole different ballgame now. Victor, I know you're weighing in with some of that, like before we.
Yeah, I want to double click on, I think, to that extent where when we think about endpoint, or at least pre 2015-ish, we think about endpoint, it's usually the 3 flavors of operating system. But I think in 2025, when we think about endpoint, or Ben, I want to know from you if the definition of endpoint has changed, because now we have IT, we have OT, we have IoTs, we have containers, we have serverless. So when we look at endpoint, where is the line drawn? And when you think about zero trust architecture, we have to think about these things at a central policy level management, if you will. Like, here are the 3 things that I don't care which type of endpoint, if you can communicate with a person or a machine, you have to adhere by. So do you think that definition of endpoint has changed now because of all of the IT, OT, IoTs? Or do you think still we are thinking about endpoint as our traditional operating systems, such as Windows, Linux, Mac, that sort of thing?
No, it encompasses everything now. I mean, even to like Fargate, right? I consider that endpoint because now you can sidecar a security product to look at it, right? And there's still threats that happen there that can happen on a traditional endpoint. So while you're erasing a Fargate when it's done, right, and it's spinning down, doesn't mean something bad can't happen. You can have container drift through it, right? So all of that I still consider an endpoint. While laptops and workstations traditionally now are a little easier to secure, like keeping up with the cloud game and like what's happening in containers, Kubernetes, and like and all that space is extremely hard because there's always something new coming out. There's always a different way to get in, bypass something, and they still need to be secured because you can still walk across the network if it's not set up correctly.
Well, I remember back in the day, Victor, to your point, where everybody kind of treated things the same. And they were like, we have to find a way to slap an agent on this device. And some of those devices being appliances that the business relies on. And I know, Ben, with your pivot into the media industry, I got to believe that that's got to be paramount, being able to monitor those non-traditional endpoints and everything like that. Something that I wanted to pivot into, that I heard you mention earlier when you were talking about the holistic view of the endpoint is device posture and device compliance. What does that look like? What does good look like for you? How do you make sure that, endpoints or, in the definition that we're talking about now, are within the compliance of the policies that you set to set out in the organization, or to make sure that the appropriate posture is kind of maintained across the organization?
Yeah, so it's like a lot of auditing, right? And I say that like we're not sitting down with auditors looking at stuff. We're looking at the rules. We're looking at how it's being set. And then we're ensuring that like devices have the things it should have before it accesses anything. Base level, like, does it have an EDR/AV? Does it have a host-based firewall running? No. Why not? Right? Is it allowed to do that? Those kind of checks and balances. Does it have an updated prevention policy, or are you doing like detection only? All those kind of things kind of start to play into like what kind of access you can get throughout the network. If you're like in a very mature zero trust, right? All those stuff is like, it's automated. Insider risk is coming into play on that, where you get to access certain things. But yeah, the checks and balances of compliances, especially like updated MDMs, you can say all those things I've just said. You can say, are you in the right AD groups? Do you have the right profiles? Does that profile fit your business unit, right? All those kind of things. Was it an accidental apply of that profile? How does that get corrected, right? And a lot of that can be done automated. A lot of it, unfortunately, has to start out with understanding it, right? So you have to have an engineer sitting down, understanding those incident tickets, understanding those help desk tickets, that onboarding experience. That's probably one of the most important things, is like understanding your corporate onboarding experience while you're in zero trust. Right?
Whoa. I just heard you saying that engineers and architects have to interact with the help desk. Like, I can tell you that I've worked with other folks in the industry who think they're above that. I would love to hear your take on that, because it sounds like it's ingrained in your DNA that working with folks in the SOC, the help desk, are key areas of input to how you secure your organization.
I think the real intelligence comes from there, right? If you sit with your help desk person, sit with your SOC, that's where the real intelligence comes in about your business. Like the people, what are they complaining about exactly? But at the same time, again, easier said than done. I'm sure someone listening there, they must be thinking that, rolling their eyes, because as an architect, as an engineer, how much time do you have that you can go sit down with your help desk and just look through the tickets, or maybe even accompany them to one of the issues and just see how the user is reacting to certain things? So it's easier said than done. But I want to double click on that one, Ben. When it comes to device posture, what is your recommendation, or what have you seen works when it comes to reevaluation of the device posture? So real time is not a thing, at least what I have seen and heard. So if I have said that I want to make sure my device is the disk is encrypted, it has hello or PIN or some sort of biometric, I want to make sure that the applications are only installed through MDM and all. How often do you reevaluate to know the posture has changed or not? Or is it real time is the way to go?
I mean, everything would be great if it was real time, right? But mistakes happen, incidents happen, life happens. I like to try to look at it bi-monthly, right? It's like, can I get to it every month? Hopefully. But it honestly needs to be a little bit more than that, especially when you're starting out, right? Because a lot of things, you place it in a policy, it may change. Business may change, things may need to happen. And really what it comes down to is like where you're getting that information from to be successful in ensuring that, right? Like you can run your self-check on your machine. An IT group can make an EXE that goes and scans, you deploy it through Intune or SCC and whatever. But it's all action about that information, right? And converging it to understand if it's still the right kind of compliance. Things change in the business you may not know about. Things change in IT you may not even know about, and you're in security, right? It's like, so keeping up with understanding the softwares that are being deployed, the needs of the business that need to happen, potential business purchases, all liquidations, things like that are a lot of things you need to understand what your device compliance should look like at that time.
Okay, so saying every month someone should look at what the policy should be, but the real-time checks using EDR, XDR solution, that's happening.
Yeah.
Okay.
It has to happen.
Got it. And with zero trust architecture, and again, Endpoint at the center of this conversation, when it comes to device posture, device management, compliance, applications are the keys of it. When we install our browser plugins, that's also factors in, because they can get access to your hardware at this point. They can actually get access to Bluetooth devices on your endpoint. So the application installation process, a lot of times it's streamlined, but others it's not, because super users, they need admin access, and they're the one who have the most access to pivot and lateral movement. So would you tell us what your recommendation would be if we are doing a zero trust architecture? How do you balance that, where I need to have an ability as a super user, super admin, to be installing anything and everything I want, but then I also have a lot of access that if I get popped, lateral movement becomes so easy for an adversary.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way is, right, allow them to do it and then scan for it, kind of. Using an app scan, you can make a list of like unwanted apps and they can send a notification out saying, hey, someone downloaded this. Or additionally, a lot of them now say someone downloaded it and executed on installing it, right? A lot of times downloads, someone downloads something, they never do anything with it. They forget, they move on, or they realize they don't need it anymore. So a lot of it now is worrying about, did it actually get installed? The harder part is putting in a procurement order, right? And understanding, like taking away a lot of your super users, only letting super users onto servers or through a PAL device, things like that. Not letting an endpoint laptop be able to have root access, right? Like, or an admin. Obviously, IT, you need some of that. Some business users need that if they need content, they need to download a vendor app to transfer files, things like that. But it should kind of go through a quick assessment, right? There's like now a lot of tools that you can send those apps through and automate and be like, yeah, that has a 5 out of 10 rating, that can get installed. It meets security requirements, things like that. There's a lot of that now that can happen and get ratings against things. And that's kind of like a mature state of like submitting it. Unfortunately, a lot of groups, right? You don't want users to have downtime, and that's the biggest pain. They go to download something, it says you're not allowed to install, you're not an admin. Even if you are an admin, you install it and your company is running an application control list, or they're running a lockdown on the OS where you can't install into the drivers and stuff like that. How do you get around that is, again, an automation and user risk profiling. Is there a certain level of kind of software you can install that doesn't have to go through that check? You know, business ratings, operation ratings, you can give stuff, but then that really means you have a mature asset list, you have a mature way of understanding what the business needs as in software. So you're already pre-marking new software, giving it a rating kind of and letting it download. Or you can take the other approach, which is kind of employee heavy, of packaging it out, right? They submit it and then you start installing it onto the select devices and kind of controlling that. But then you get into upgrades and needing to requirements of not allowing auto upgrades and things like that.
So Ben, that's a good segue into kind of our last question that we have for you here is when we think about kind of the zero trust journey for a lot of organizations, the thing that seems to get left by the wayside as folks pursue all these things we're talking about is ultimately the user experience, or users getting frustrated with the different technology or the different policies being rolled out. Can you talk about kind of your experience with that? Talk about maybe things that you've had to navigate through where users got frustrated by some of this new technology rolling out, how you've dealt with that, or maybe how you got ahead of it.
Yeah, a lot of that comes to kind of like a culture, right? And like splitting that from like finance to like media or to like another sector, like finance where we worked at, where it was very heavily on like security focus, very like user security as well. Users got heavily trained in security. We had the icons up on the bottom of the screen, right? They could run their own scans. They can look to see what was being kind of blocked, right? Give them kind of the onus to take that data and then come to someone and be like, I have a problem, instead of hiding in the shadows, right? A lot of people, they don't want to see the icon. They don't want to get a pop-up. They don't want to be annoyed. That's fine. But then you get a ticket opened up and it's like, I have an issue. What is the issue, right? And then that's kind of where you got to step forward in like your troubleshooting skills and using EDR platforms to look to see what the problem is. That's probably the hardest thing, is like understanding where you want pain points, right? Sometimes pain points are needed, right? Because then people come forward with like legitimate malware. So I want to install this. Well, let me look at it. No, you can't install that. That's got malware in it. Or like, I want to do this. And it's like, well, that makes your job easier. That can open you up to an attack surface problem, or like, so I don't really have a good way to do it other than acting quickly. Get asked the right questions, get the information in there, try to, if one person has that problem, most likely someone else is going to have that problem, and correct it, right? Put it into the policy. You know, these people are going to need it. You know, this group, someone else in this group is probably going to ask you the same thing. Just fix it for the enterprise instead of solutioning it for a single person. When you're solutioning for a single person, you're on the help desk all day. You're with the help desk. Your tickets are getting routed over there. When you solution for the enterprise, when a single person has an issue, no one else has the issue after that, and everything starts to get streamlined a little bit better instead of just chopping down tickets and kind of like overriding admin rights or things like that, or like moving policy and just taking guesses of like what the right AD group is and things like that to get them to access it.
Awesome. Ben, thank you for comparing kind of the two industries, because that was the other thing that I wanted to highlight for our viewers, because I've seen a lot of people stay within the same industry for a long time. So adapting to the different industry cultural norms and kind of the way that they approach security is always really interesting for our viewers. Ben, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It was such a pleasure to have you. As always, thank you to our viewers for checking out this episode. You can look forward to more of these types of things. We're bringing you folks that have implemented different zero trust solutions and zero trust architectures in their enterprises. And we hope you'll catch us on the next episode. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
That's a wrap on this Zero Trust journey. Now it's your turn. Step into the spotlight, share your story, and be part of the journey. Subscribe to Zero Trust Journey on LinkedIn for the latest news, events, and giveaways. Until next time.